Hi guys, this is chapter 6, Business Cycles and Unemployment. So in this chapter we're going to answer these 3 questions. How are cycles measured? What causes business cycles? What is unemployment? So a business cycle is the alternating periods of economic growth and contraction, which can be measured by changes in real GDP, which we talked about last chapter. So gross domestic product, GDP, is the value of all final goods and services produced in a nation during a period of time, which is usually a year. There's 4 phases of the business cycle. There's the peak, the recession, the trough, and the recovery period. The peak is the phase of the business cycle during which the GDP reaches its maximum after rising through a recovery. So this is our economic system we're talking about. It's where our economy is really good, and it's the highest it's going to be. It's the best it's going to be before dropping and after rising. A recession is a downturn in the business cycle during which the real GDP declines and the unemployment rate rises, also called a contraction. So the recession is the downhill part after the peak. We're going to look at a graph here in a second. How long before a downturn is a recession? As a general rule, at least 2 consecutive quarters in which real GDP is declining, we call a recession. So the GDP has to be less than it was the year before, 2 years in a row, before we can consider a recession. And then once GDP comes back up, we consider ourselves out. So when is a downturn considered a depression? So we have a recession and a depression. The term depression is primarily just a historical reference. It's basically a really bad recession. Extremely deep and long recession of the early 1930s was called the Depression. It was called the Great Depression. Probably learned about it way back when in high school. So technically, on the business cycle, there is not a depression. It's just what we consider to be a really long recession is a depression where the GDP continues to decline. A trough is the phase of the business cycle in which the real GDP reaches its minimum after falling during a recession. So we have one more, and that is the recovery. It's an upturn in the business cycle during which the real GDP rises, and it's also called an expansion. So we have the peak, which is at the top, the recovery, the trough, and the recession. So here is a graph, and this is one of the peaks. A peak, again, is the highest point that the GDP gets to before it drops. So there are 2 peaks. There's a peak at the bottom and a peak at the top. And throughout the 1 year, we had 2 peaks. From peak to peak was our year. So even though one peak is way higher than another peak, it is the highest point in which the GDP gets before it drops again. So if you notice the first peak, it drops right after. This is on page 160 of your books if you want to go to read this. You can see the trough where it's at the lowest it got before climbing up again. The recession period is the peak, the difference between the peak, or the relationship between the peak and the trough, where you go down. And then when it starts to climb up, it's recovery. You get to a peak, go back down through a recession, hit the trough, go back up through recovery to the peak, and it keeps going on and on and on and on. And this is our growth trend line. So we're trending upward, even though we go up and down at some points. Here's an actual business cycle. This is one that is for a 1 year period in billions in 2005. So this is a United States, in 2005 from year to year. So you have, this is what it looks like usually. It's not the smooth curvy lines from the graph before. It's actually more jagged. You can see the small peak in 2001, and then the trough at the end of 2001, and then a long recovery period before a peak in 2007. And then if you remember correctly, 2007 is when our recession kind of started, and we ended up with the housing market faulting, and you can see that line start to recede down into what ended up being quite a long recession that we still are kind of entangled in. So on page 161 of your textbooks, you'll find this. It's the severity of post-World War II recessions. So these are all the recessions we've been in since the World War II. You can see the beginning, the top one is November 1948 to October 1949. It was 11 months long, and the GDP declined 1.7%. And the highest unemployment rate at that time was 7.9%. And the last one that they've dated, in this text anyways, is from December 2007 to 2009, and that was that recessionary period with the housing market that I was telling you about. The duration was 18 months, and the percentage in decline in GDP was 3.5%, which is the highest. And unemployment, the highest unemployment got was 9.5%. So that one was the last one, if you guys remember hearing about it all the time. You can see the average too, which is kind of cool. So our average recession in the United States is 11 months, and we average about a 1.9 decrease in GDP when we're in a recession, and you can assume that the unemployment rate is going to be about 7.6% during a recession. So economic growth is an expansion in national output measured by the annual percentage increase in a nation's real GDP. So how much our GDP increases from year to year is how we measure economic growth. Producing more products annually as a nation is how we can justify if we're growing as a nation or not. So why is growth an economic goal? It's basically because there's more money to go around. It increases our standard of living and creates a bigger economic pie. So there's more money to go around, which means everybody gets more than they're used to. On page 162, you will see this graph. It's the annual GDP zigs and zags, basically. Zero growth is marked with the red line, and long-term average growth is marked to see where we're at as a nation. So this is our average growth dotted line, the black one, at 3.5 annual percentage growth, 3.5% growth rate. At zero growth, when we dip below that red line, we actually are declining in GDP, meaning we're in the negative. We're not doing very good. And if you see on page 162, it says the real GDP has increased at an average growth rate of 3.5% since the 1930s, before the World War. And above average growth rates have alternated between below average growth rates, and during the Great Recession in 2007, the annual growth rate was a negative 2.4% in 2009, therefore below the growth line. And again in 2007, it just continued to drop on the way out. This graph is the 2009 GDP national rankings. It's on page 164 of your books. You can see where these are the growth percentages. So you can see where China is gaining GDP each year by about 8.5% on average. The India is also gaining GDP, and as on an average, the United States, you can see in the pink there, is losing momentum on their GDP by about 2.4% in 2009. So you can kind of see where we were at in 2009. I expect it to be better if you look at a current chart, since we're not in the recession anymore. 2009 was in the middle of our Great Recession. China was doing well. So there are 3 types of economic indicators: leading, coincident, and lagging indicators. We're going to talk about each one of these real quick. A leading indicator is a variable variables that change before real GDP changes. So in other words, the indicators may cause the GDP to change. So if we have a tsunami or something like that happen, it's a leading indicator that perhaps GDP might change from this. Here is, and this is Exhibit 5 in your book. These are some common leading indicators that if these happen to show up in the United States, we can almost assume they're going to change our GDP in some sort of a way. Our GDP will change afterwards. So if our average work week goes up, we can assume that GDP will go up because we're making more products. If it goes down, our average work week, then we can assume people aren't working as much and our GDP will go down. Unemployment claims, new consumer goods orders, delayed deliveries, new orders for plant and equipment, which is our land, assets, buildings, cars, those kind of things. New building permits, stock prices, whether they go up or down, money supply, whether it goes up or down, interest rates going up or down will indicate how much we buy as a nation and how much our GDP will go up or down. And then again, consumer expectations. These will all change, and then as they change, they'll be followed by a change in GDP. A coincident indicator is a variable that changes at the same time that real GDP changes. So our leading indicators change before GDP changes and causes a change in GDP. These are going to change at the same time. They don't play a direct part in changing the GDP, but they change coincidentally with GDP. So they call it a coincident because they're not 100% sure that one is caused by the other. So here are 5 coincident indicators. We can assume that when non-agricultural payrolls go up or down, GDP will go up or down. Personal income minus transfer payments, and we talked about transfer payments being money exchanged between hands that does not have to do with buying a product or service. Industrial production, manufacturing, and trade sales, those are all going to change at the same time as GDP and doesn't have a direct relationship with GDP. A lagging indicator are variables that change after GDP changes. So these things are going to change after GDP changes. So it's like a cause and effect. You have your leading indicators, then you have your change in GDP, and then you have your lagging indicators that are going to say, oh yeah, GDP changed because this such and such happened. And here are the such and suches. They're the lagging indicators. When GDP changes, unemployment rates change, the duration of unemployment changes, labor costs per unit of output change, consumer price index for services changes, commercial and industrial loans change, commercial credit to personal income ratio changes, and the interest rate, prime interest rate changes. We're going to talk about these a little bit in more detail as we go. The unemployment rate is the percentage of people in the civilian labor force who are without jobs, and they have to be actively seeking jobs. Here's the tricky thing about unemployment. We watch it go up and down. We've watched it with the presidential elections, them argue about whether unemployment is higher or lower at the beginning of, say, Obama's term. Here's the funny thing you have to watch is people without jobs sometimes are considered unemployed. And that's not the case. They have to be without jobs and actively seeking jobs. So those that are on welfare and not actively seeking jobs are not actually considered part of the unemployment rate. So just to clarify that unemployment is more than just the unemployment rate. It should be added into welfare and unemployment together consist of the unemployed. So, and then consequently, as unemployment goes up, as welfare, if welfare numbers are increasing, then unemployment is going down and making it look like more people have jobs. So just keep in mind that unemployment rate is the civilian labor force without jobs, but they have to be actively seeking a job. So how the unemployment rate is calculated: each month the BLS, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, surveys 60,000 households at random. And the civilian labor force, just a term, are people over 16 years old. They're either employed or actively seeking a job, including members of the armed forces, homemakers, and people in institutions. So people who are considered employed is anyone who works at least 1 hour a week for a pay, or at least 15 hours per week as an unpaid worker in a family business. Anyone who is 16 years of age and above who is actively seeking employment is considered unemployed if they don't have a job. A discouraged worker isn't necessarily an unhappy worker, but a person who wants to work but who has given up searching for work. So if they're not actively seeking, they're technically not unemployed, but they're considered a discouraged worker. And unemployment mainly considers of these. Here's a little graph in Exhibit 6. It's on page 167 of your text. It is the population, employment, and unemployment of 2009. So the total population age 16 and over, not in the labor force, are armed forces, household workers, students, retirees, people with disabilities, institutionalized people, and discouraged workers. In the civilian labor force, we have the employed, the employees, and the self-employed. And the unemployed, we have new entrants, re-entrants, lost their last job, quit their last job, or were paid off, or laid off, sorry. Paid off. So, to get our unemployment rate, we take our unemployed and divide by the number of civilian labor force, the people in the civilian labor force. And then multiply by 100, and that's the only reason why we ever multiply by 100 in this text is to get a percent. So basically you take your number when you divide the unemployed by the civilian labor force, and then make that number a percentage. Exhibit 6, this is what I was talking about, population, employment, and unemployment of 2009. Unemployment, the total civilian population age 16 and over was 235.8 million people. The ones not in the labor force was 81.7 million people. So to get our civilian labor force, you subtract those two. Employed, 139.8 million people, and unemployed, 14.3 million people. So to get our unemployment, we take our 14.3 million people are unemployed and divide it by our civilian labor force, which is our 154.1 million. And when you do that, you get 0.0927. And when you multiply by 100 and round, just make that number a percentage, and it's 9.3%. So our unemployment rate in 2009 was 9.3%, which is really high. And in 2009, we were at the middle of our Great Recession. Here's an exhibit, Exhibit 7, page 168 of your text. It is the United States unemployment rates from 1929 to 2009. So in the 30s, during the Great Depression, it was its ultimate high. And then you can see where it zigged and zagged down through the years. And it was on the climb back in 2009 when we were in our Great Recession. Our recession that we went through was pretty horrible. But it was nothing compared to the Great Depression, as you can see. We had high unemployment rates but they were nothing compared to the Depression in the 30s. Exhibit 8 is another FYI slide, is the unemployment rates for selected nations in 2009. So you can see in 2009, Spain had an unemployment rate of 18.1%. And then Turkey, 14.6%, and so on down the road. 9.3% was high for the United States, but you can see that other countries were struggling a little bit more. The criticisms of the employment rate, there's a few things. It does not include discouraged workers. Some of us think that discouraged workers, people not actively searching for jobs, should be included in unemployment. They're still unemployed, they're just not actively searching. The other criticisms is that it includes part-time workers. Some people think that part-time workers should not be included in the employment field. They should be separate. And also another one is they don't measure underemployment, which would be welfare. Someone with a degree working in a lower position sometimes is considered underemployment. So if you have a degree to be a doctor and you're working as a waitress or a waiter, then you consider underemployed, which isn't 100% employed in some people's mind. So underemployment, people working at jobs below their skill level. There I was getting ahead of the slide. And then we have the different types of unemployment. We have frictional, structural, and cyclical. Frictional unemployment is normal search time required by workers with marketable skills who are changing jobs, re-entering or entering the labor force, or are seasonally unemployed. So we can be unemployed. If you sell Christmas trees, you're going to be unemployed in June and July, probably. And that's frictional unemployment, meaning it happens sometimes. It's short-term unemployment. You have employment, it's just not year-round. Structural unemployment is a mismatch of the skills of workers out of work and the skills required for existing job opportunities. So you might have jobs open in the United States, but the qualified people to fill them are rare. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment caused by the lack of jobs during a recession, and that's kind of what we went through our Great Recession. It's caused by the business cycle, and it's kind of like musical chairs. There's not enough jobs for the workers who need them. Full employment is when an economy operates at the unemployment rate equal to the sum of frictional and structural unemployment rates. It's also called the natural rate of unemployment. So full employment don't mean 0% unemployment. It just means that the unemployment exists without cyclical employment, meaning unemployment is not because of a recession. As long as we're not in a recession, it's considered full employment. What rate is considered full employment? The natural rate of unemployment changes over time, but today it is considered to be about 5%. So if we were at 5% unemployment, we would be considered full employment, if that makes sense. It's just the normal rate of unemployment because we're never going to have the exact matchup. There's always going to be open jobs, but people wanting jobs at the same time when there's not a recession. So as long as there's not a recession going on, we're operating at full employment, which is about 5%. The GDP gap, you're going to look at again and you're going to get about one graph for this chapter. But the GDP gap is the difference between actual and full employment. So we take our actual real GDP and subtract our potential real GDP, and we get our GDP through the GDP gap. Let's look at it. We'll look at a graph here in a second. So what is the cost of cyclical unemployment? The GDP gap. So anytime that there's a GDP gap, positive, then or negative, then there's either a recession going on or some sort of phase in the business cycle that's allowing there to be a gap. So here is the actual and potential GDP from 1997 to 2009. And this is in your text, page 175, Exhibit 9. And let's look at that real quick. Says the GDP gap is the difference between actual and potential real GDP, which is based on the assumption that the economy operates at full employment. A positive gap means there's a boom in the economy when workers are employed overtime. And between 97 and 2000, the U.S. economy has experienced a positive GDP gap, meaning people were not only employed, but they were working overtime. And that's your blue sections where our actual GDP is above our potential GDP. And the recession in 2001 reversed the GDP gap, and the economy operated with a negative gap when we were running below our potential. And that is when we are in the red on this graph. So if we're in the blue, people are working overtime and happy. If we're in the red, then we have high unemployment and not enough jobs to go around. So the conclusion of this chapter, the gap between the actual and potential GDP measures the monetary money losses of real goods and services when we're less than at full employment. Here's an FYI slide, Exhibit 10 in your books. It's going to break up the unemployment by selected demographic groups. So overall, in 2009, we were at 9.3% unemployment. The ratio between male and female, 10.3% of that 9.3% were male, and 8.1% were female. Race, white Americans were 8.5% unemployed. Hispanics 12.1%, and African American 14.8%. Teenagers 16 to 19 years old as a whole were 24.3% unemployed. White teenagers 21.8% unemployed, Hispanics 30.2%, and so on and so forth. Education is the interesting one. If you have less than a high school diploma, 14.6% of the people in the United States were unemployed. And if there was a bachelor's degree or higher, a 4.6% unemployment rate. And then high school graduates were at 9.7%. So there's a little trend there that says the more education you get, the more likely you are to be employed. And that is it. Be sure to take your quiz over this chapter by Friday.